Hello and welcome to my presentation. Today we're going to talk about Cairo and its space and place. I couldn't do this work in Teams as you suggested. I tried to contact my classmate, but I could never get a reach of her. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the introduction. We're going to talk about the geopolitical features of Egypt's capital, which is Cairo, of course. Cairo is Egypt's capital, as I just said, and it is located in the north of Africa and in the southeast of the Mediterranean Sea, very close to the coast. It is embedded into the very limited fertile space provided by the River Nile. Cairo's downtown area, near Tahrir Square, is home to Egypt's political, economical, and military centers and their headquarters. Since the last century, the city has been very populated, with the Greater Cairo area and its surrounding satellite city, which we're going to talk about very briefly. Um, they're home to over 20 million people. So a fifth of Egypt's total population lives in the greater Cairo metropolitan area. The city is very densely populated thanks to the very limited amount of habitable space along the Nile's banks and the lacking amount of social infrastructure provided by the state to facilitate the lives of the millions that work and live in the city. The Egyptian state has been very famous for avoiding investing in infrastructure and investing it in other less useful things to the general public that we're going to talk about in a lot of depth very soon. The country's poor rural workers started to pour in during the 20th century in hope of finding a better life. They started to move to Cairo. They moved, but the city couldn't hold them, and it still can't sustain that amount of people. Cairo has some of the highest population densities in the world. It has a higher population density than New York City, Shanghai, and London. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the modern Egyptian narrative before we get into the interactive map. The country's leaders, many of them, have tried to fix Egypt's, especially Cairo's, overpopulation problem by creating satellite cities around the Cairo proper metropolitan area. However, many of these projects did not include affordable housing for the people that lived in Cairo and needed to be more dispersed in order to fix the problems with density. And were only an attempt at westernizing Egypt with very big and beautiful American style suburban areas connected by massive highways. But of course, all of these areas couldn't be accessed if you didn't have a car, which many of the people that live in Cairo aren't economically able to get a car. So many of these cities cost billions of dollars to the government, and yet almost all of them are half empty. Some of them are even 20% empty, with a lot of empty houses that aren't being used because no one can afford them. The current president of Egypt is Abdel Fattah el Sisi. Abdel was a former military leader of Egypt when Hosni Mubarak, the president that at that time was overthrown by a series of revolts in Cairo. So they basically reunited in Tahrir Square, which is basically uh, our uh, our version of El Zócalo here in Mexico City. And they protested against the government. And because the government buildings are so close by, they had no other option because of the amount of people protesting to give in to the people's requests. So he was overthrown, and then Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was elected, or so they say. Um, so Abdel Fattah, in an attempt to protect his power, has started operations in the city and its surrounding areas to protect the government from potential revolts. So that's the narrative from Abdel, that his people, which are a lot of them, they're basically a plague, and there's way too many of them. And he fears them a lot because there's so many of them. So he's gone through a bunch of steps to protect his city, or his power, I mean. He's ordered the construction of many of the city's avenues to make them wider, as roadblocks and barricades are much harder to create. And also, this lets the Egyptian military to move quickly through the avenues, so they can deploy quickly to arrest or disest any type of revolt. He's made the main square of Cairo, which is Tahrir Square, harder to protest in by adding large monuments, barriers, and security personnel. So it's basically not inviting them to go ahead and give their free speech. I didn't include it on the list, but he's also been attacking a lot of free speech lately, or so several news outlets like Vox have been writing. And finally, and most importantly, which is what this presentation is principally about, is that he's moving the country's economical, political, and even military centers to a new capital, 50 kilometers away from their old positions. The new capital. The new capital of Egypt will cost about $45 billion to build, which is a lot of money, and is Egypt's brand new attempt at fixing the population problem, which has been done many times before. As you can see in the map, we have Al Marj, El Bur, El Shork, New Cairo City, Helwan, and Giza, which are all cities that were built after Cairo to quote unquote fix the population problem. But again, these are only available for richer families and people. This is not the interactive map, by the way, and I'm sorry if I butchered any of Cairo's names. I cannot talk. I cannot say their names properly. I'm not sure how. The only issue is that the government isn't addressing the general population, and this is not because they're ignorant. It's just because they don't want to, and their narrative is so much different to help them. They don't want to help them. They want to protect their power and then maybe help them. And instead of leaving them in Cairo and starting fresh, uh, and instead of fixing these issues, they're just going to leave Cairo and they're going to start fresh 50 kilometers away. Uh, with little to no public transport infrastructure, so they can't really get there to protest if they even wanted to, because most of them don't have cars, and it's a 50-kilometer trip. That is quite a lot of kilometers for the average Cairo liver, which doesn't have that much money, unfortunately. This is of course to assure the government's capability of survival, and it's hard imagining millions of Egyptians making the 50-kilometer trip to protest in the new capital. It is very unlikely that they would. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the map. Okay, so this is kind of an aerial view of the current situation. As you can see, in the north, to the east, to the south, and to the west, you can see Pyramid Gardens, El Hawamdey, Isvat et Tualai, El Obur City, New Cairo City, El Shuruk, and Badar City, and 10th of Ramadan cities. All of these cities have been built to quote unquote alleviate the population problem in Cairo. But again, most of these are half empty because you need a car to live there to begin with, and they don't offer any affordable housing solutions. So we're going to start with the first one, which is the poorest of the four, is the greater Cairo metropolitan area, and they all live near the Nile River banks, which does not give optimal living conditions. It is extremely overpopulated. There's a lot of traffic. It is impossible to move around effectively. There is no such thing as infrastructure or public transport in the place to begin with, and whatever reminiscence of public transport there is not good at all. So instead of fixing these issues and investing money for the greater good of generations of Egyptian leaders, have invested ridiculous amount of capital in projects that only benefit themselves, the rich, the powerful, and the elite. So this is one of the examples. This was built in 1950 in New Cairo City by Abdel Hassan Lemeh. Throughout the 20th century, many of Egypt's past leaders started to brand new cities in the Greater Cairo area in order to fix the issues with overpopulation in the country. But as I've said, like in the fifth time this presentation, because I want to make it really clear, these areas were secluded from Cairo proper. They didn't offer any way of getting there effectively without a car, so no infrastructure at all, and most importantly, no affordable housing for those living within the slums of poorer neighborhoods of Cairo. So the people that are living in Cairo in worse conditions can't move here because they can't afford it. So these cities are basically for show. They want to look all fancy to the Western world and to the world in general. So we're gonna give us a little comparative between what they're building and what is the current situation in Cairo. Egypt's new administrative capital will continue to push the current government narrative of segregating those who have limited opportunities back in old Cairo and have the country's elite live in accessible and unaffordable areas of the metropolitan proper area. Of course, up here is a render photo provided by the Egyptian government. I pulled this off right from their website. As you can see, it is beautiful. It's basically Egyptian Miami, with many intricate roads and highways, but it doesn't have any type of infrastructure plan, and this is already being built, and they haven't done a single thing to give it public transport or give it any type of more popular services, which people without money can afford. This is basically only selective for the rich of Egypt, the businessmen, the elite, military and political leaders. And this is an actual photo of the Al Salahin neighborhood in Cairo. As you can see, it's just basically a slum. Everything's in horrible conditions. There's no space to live, and they're all cramped up in a very small and bad area. And not only are the people of Cairo being unattended while a multi-billion-dollar project is being erected 50 kilometers away from them, but the moving of government buildings says something else. They're moving all the government buildings, of course, to diminish any threat of the population's ability to express themselves and against their government. So they're basically moving all the government buildings very far away, and they're building a military complex barrack next to the new administrative capital to protect power. The new government, they built a government plaza, and it has an open ground like Plaza Zocalo area type area designated for protests. But of course, it is 50 kilometers away. There's no way to get there without having a car, and it is very hard to imagine the people that live in the slums of Cairo and are mad at their government walking or taking a 50-kilometer trip to the east to protest in the scorching sun that is of Egypt. And that is basically the presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and again, I'm sorry that I didn't include my partner. I had no clue what happened to them.